Hello everyone. So, if you're watching this video on the day it came out, then hopefully it is the 29th of September 2020. And this particular day marks the 25th anniversary of the PlayStation 1 being launched in Europe. So, in honor of this momentous occasion, I'm going to create a brief retrospective video covering the console, similar to what I have done with the Dreamcast and the Mega Drive last year on their 20th and 30th anniversaries. So, in this video, I'm going to briefly cover the story of the system before launch, as in certain events that led to the PlayStation happening in the first place. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the launch itself and how the launch basically cemented the PlayStation as a huge success for the generation, basically set the standard for where it ended up at the end of the generation. Then we will discuss what I think of the aesthetics of the console itself, the design of the controllers, etc. And then I'll mention a lot of games that were very popular on the system or that I really enjoy playing. And then we'll finish with some final thoughts. Now, this console was a big part of a lot of people's lives. So if there's a specific game that I don't mention later on, don't be offended by it. It's not that I hate the game or anything. It's just that as I'll get into later, there are so many games on the PlayStation that it's impossible to name everybody's favorite. Like, there are over 2,000 individual titles released for this console. So mentioning everybody's favorite is an impossibility unless you want a video that lasts all day long. So, covering everything would be completely unrealistic. So, to begin with, the PlayStation didn't initially start its life out as its own standalone video game console. And originally, Sony wasn't even planning on making a game console. The original plan for the PlayStation was to be a planned add-on for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, of all things. There are already a lot of videos discussing how that happened, why that happened, and ultimately why it didn't fall through. So, I don't plan on going into too much detail about that story here, but I do plan on saving the entire topic as a whole for its own longer video at some point in the future, because it is a very interesting story and it's convoluted. It's, a really interesting piece of video game history that I do want to cover eventually, but it ultimately isn't too important to the celebration of the PlayStation itself. It's more some background information. But for now, I'll just say that Sony and Nintendo were working well together with the Super Nintendo, as Sony had provided certain components for the Super Nintendo, mostly to do with the sound processing. And both companies were getting along really well with each other, and they had planned to create a CD-based add-on for the SNES. Now, this plan was going pretty well. Everything was falling through. Things were looking great. But one day, Nintendo basically took a closer look at the contract they had signed with Sony, and they realized they wouldn't be making any money or very little money off this add-on, as Sony would be profiting from just about everything, including the hardware sales, any sales for the proprietary format, and the big one was game sales. Like, Nintendo would be creating a ton of big brand new games for this CD-based add-on, and they would be seeing almost no money, if not any money at all, from the sales of these games. So obviously, Nintendo realized this was a bad deal, and they tried to back out of it, and Sony was like, nope, you've signed this, you've agreed to this, we've been working on this for years now, can't just go changing your mind now. So Nintendo basically went behind Sony's back, struck a new deal with Philips, which was going down the same road again, planning a CD-based add-on, but that never happened, and I'd get into that in another video. But basically, all that came of that was a couple of Nintendo games being released on the Philips CDI. Never heard of it? Well, it wasn't popular. And obviously Sony were pretty annoyed about this, because at the time, Sony and Philips were the two biggest technological conglomerates on the planet. So Nintendo had basically gone and worked with Sony's greatest enemies. So Sony decided they'd go work with Sega as a response. So Sony basically created some games for the Sega Genesis slash Mega Drive, but mostly the Sega CD, just to really annoy Nintendo. And obviously, this caused a lot of trouble, because it was there's two planned add-ons. Sony's working with everybody else, Philips is working with everybody else, Nintendo's working with everybody else. It's complicated for developers. So they all eventually came to an agreement where the whole deal would essentially get called off. Everyone would just go back to what they were doing. Nintendo would go forward to make the N64 and the Virtual Boy. Sega would go forward with the Saturn. And Sony decided that they already had been planning to make their own console, because that's what they had decided to do after Nintendo basically caused all the drama between the two companies. So Sony were going to continue making their own console, known as the PlayStation, and that eventually evolved into the console that we know today. Essentially, one slight mistake from Nintendo with that contract created their biggest competitor in the industry. Just a little bit of a screw up there, if you ask me. So, that's a very brief summary of that whole series of events. Like, there's a lot more detail I could go into, but that would be long enough for its own separate video, so it's going to come in the future. So, with the original PlayStation, you've got to understand two main things. Firstly, when Sony entered the market, or were planning on entering the market, they weren't immediately accepted as a video game console manufacturer like they are today. In fact, many were very skeptical of the decision to enter this market, and to be fair, they weren't really wrong for doing so, as Sony were mainly associated with stuff like televisions, audio equipment, any other sector of technology that wasn't video games. As I said earlier, their only prior video game business was working with Sega briefly, just to annoy Nintendo, publishing games for Sega CD. So, it's understandable why people were skeptical of this. And the other main reason for this was because the fifth generation of video game consoles, which is what the PlayStation belongs to, didn't start when the PlayStation Saturn came out in 95. It started in 1993, and there were 6 different video game consoles that came out between 1993 and 1995 before the PlayStation and the Saturn came out, and they had basically come and gone. You've never heard of any of them because none of them did very well in particular at all. The only one really that anybody kind of knows is the Atari Jaguar, which was the most successful out of the group, but it didn't do very well either. So the fifth generation is basically known as a huge graveyard of consoles that had tried to essentially become the next Sega. And that was basically what the fifth generation was all about, because the fourth generation with the Sega Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo, Sega had proved that you don't have to be Nintendo to make money in the video game hardware industry. So other companies took notice of that and said, yeah, we could do that too. And they tried, and they failed. They all failed so miserably. Like, there's a reason you've never heard of any of them. So, it was perfectly acceptable for any of them, for everyone to be skeptical of the PlayStation entering the market because so many had tried and so many had failed. And there really was no substantial evidence to suggest that the PlayStation 1 would be any different up until they finally showed off the system working in action and announced the price, which we'll get into later. So, of course, we know that ultimately the PlayStation was a huge success, as Sony is still making PlayStation consoles to this day. They're going to be releasing the PS5 later this year. And now it seems like Sony is mostly known for making PlayStation, when back in the day they were known for almost everything else. Like the PlayStation was just something that a small portion of the company was working on. Like, they were still focused on making high quality televisions, audio equipment, everything like that. Like, Sony used to be known for a lot more than just PlayStation, but now it seems like you ask the average person, they just know, yeah, Sony makes PlayStation. So, in theory, there was nothing to suggest that the PlayStation should be super successful and the other console of the fifth generation couldn't have succeeded in the same way. The honest truth is, and this isn't trying to be insulting to the PlayStation in any way, because I love this system. It was one of the first systems I ever got. But the honest truth of the matter is Sony got lucky with timing, and they did make a lot of right decisions, but they got lucky because so many had tried and failed before them, and none of them had taken off in the way the PlayStation would eventually. And their competitors, Sega and Nintendo, just kept screwing up this generation. Sega more so than Nintendo for sure, but it wasn't a great generation for either company, and it basically allowed Sony to just become this huge success in the video game industry. And now the PlayStation is an iconic part of video game history, all due to a lot of problems and internal communications and arrogant business decisions that led to Nintendo and Sega both messing up this generation. And it allowed the PlayStation, the newcomer, which shouldn't have been as successful as it was, to just dominate sales charts all throughout the year. And to be fair to Sony, they did make a lot of right decisions as well. But in theory, Sega could have made these decisions as well. And Nintendo could have made decisions as well, but they were already set in their ways with the N64. But Sega had a CD-based system. They could have done the same thing, but they made a lot of mistakes with the Saturn that a lot of people don't want to, like a lot of huge Sega Saturn fans don't want to really admit how much of a script Saturn was and how much it set Sega back. But it really wasn't a great move. As much as I love the Saturn, it didn't help Sega at all in the long run. And that's the same story with the N64, and I'm guaranteeing people aren't going to be happy that I said that. But anyway, the PlayStation had a cheap price. It used CD technology. And Nintendo and Sega just couldn't stop screwing up this generation. All of this led to the PlayStation becoming a huge success and ultimately an iconic part of video game history. Now, I have briefly spoken before about the problems Nintendo and more specifically Sega made this generation in other videos, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about their mistakes here. However, as we discuss certain things, these mistakes will inevitably be brought up as they are crucial to the PlayStation's launch and ultimate success. With that being said, let's talk about the Saturn. I'm kidding. So, as the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn were set to launch in November of 1995 in the US. Actually, let's just sidetrack here. The PlayStation is 25 years old in Europe today, but it had its Japanese launch anniversary a while back, and its North American launch is later. But the thing is, with older game consoles, they would always come to Europe last. Like, games and game consoles would always release in Europe last, and it would never be this huge, giant, celebrated thing. Like, if people are talking about the launches of game consoles, they're usually referring to the Japanese launch because it was the first place it launched, or the American launch because it was usually the biggest launch. You don't hear a lot of people talk about the European launches, and that's not because they're bad. They're basically the exact same, just later on. But for whatever reason, the European launches just never seem as spectacular as the American launches, and they don't get the recognition of the Japanese launches because the Japanese launches were always first. So they get recognition for being the first time the system launched, the first time it was available, etc. And a lot of the stories that led to the PlayStation 1's success, specifically with the Saturn, not so much the Nintendo 64 because the launch really didn't have anything to do with that, but the launch story I'm about to tell you with the Saturn and the PlayStation 1 is largely based from the American market perspective, but it had a knock-on effect on the European market as well. So with that being said, the Saturn and the PS1 were set to launch in November of 1995 in the US. Sega had announced at history's first E3 press conference that the Saturn would cost $499. And the problem with this was not $499, $399. I wrote $499. It's $400. Right. But the Saturn would cost $399. But instead of launching it in November like they planned, they jumped the launch to the day of the press conference, which still goes down in history as one of Sega's biggest mistakes. Like, you've got the 32X, and then you've got this. Like, this hurt the Saturn so much, because by jumping the launch date ahead by a good few months, honestly, I think it's about 4 months they launched it ahead, it gave developers less time to complete their games, leading to a weaker launch lineup, and in some cases, games had to be pushed back entirely. The games that did come out famously had launch issues, like they were glitchy, they didn't work properly, they weren't of high quality, and later on they got re-releases, like Daytona USA is a launch title for the Saturn, and it got a re-release later called Daytona USA Championship Edition, which fixed all of the problems that were present in the launch version. They pissed off developers a lot with this, and they also annoyed retailers, because usually, if you go into a store months before a console launches, they've usually got promotional or up for the system, like promoting the system coming out, games that are coming out. But by jumping the launch date ahead so much, they hadn't given retailers enough time to prepare for the system. They hadn't given them enough time to hype up the consumers. So retailers didn't have anywhere near as much incentive to stock the Saturn because most consumers would just see it and be surprised that it was out and they wouldn't know much about it because they hadn't ever heard of it, because E3 now is a big thing for the public to watch, but back then it was really just a press conference. Like, it wasn't broadcast anywhere. It wasn't like a big event like it is now. It was just a thing for the press. So you would never know that the Saturn had launched until it just popped up in stores one day, and most people would never have heard of it. So they've not had any time to get excited about the system. They've just come off the back of 32X, which was discontinued less than a year after launch. And on top of that, the launch lineup is weak, and games that did launch were incredibly flawed. So it's not difficult to see how this launch of the Saturn really cemented the Saturn in a losing place for the entire generation. But to add even further insult to injury, this botched launch didn't even help Sega at all. Because when the PS1 did launch in November like it was planned to, it sold more units in its first week than the Saturn had done in the 4 months it had been available before the PlayStation came out. Talk about a failure. So, Sony, by comparison, in their E3 conference, simply had the head of Sony Computer Entertainment walk up on stage and simply say, $299. And then he walked off. Didn't say anything else. I mean, the Saturn had a weak launch lineup to begin with. The Saturn was being released way ahead of schedule, so no one had any time to prepare for it. The PlayStation was coming out, had a much stronger launch lineup. It had superior hardware at a cheaper price. There was no competition. Like, the PlayStation was the console to buy in 1995 and beyond, because the competition was, the previous gen systems, which were still selling well and still getting new games out. But if you're looking for a brand new system, your choices were basically the Saturn, the 32X technically, even though support was just done with it, but it still existed, I guess, the PlayStation 1, and the Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy was discontinued a couple months after that. The Saturn had a pretty weak launch lineup. The 32X was done already. So if you wanted a new system, the PlayStation 1 was the undeniable best choice at the time. So, with that happening, some people believed that when Nintendo brought out their next console, at the time codenamed the Ultra 64, Sony would just be blown away, as both the NES and SNES had been the top consoles in their previous generations. And Sony were the new guys who were going up against Nintendo, who had over 10 years of experience, a successful experience in this industry at that. However, Nintendo also messed up, as I've mentioned a couple times. Their decision to use cartridges on the N64 was incredibly controversial and incredibly confusing, not only to consumers who had basically seen the PlayStation and, to a lesser extent, the Saturn using these CDs, which they believed were just the new, innovative, new way that video games would be played, and then see this brand new, super powerful console from Nintendo that, was still using cartridges, was confusing to them. But it was also incredibly controversial and confusing to developers, especially developers. A lot of Nintendo's previous third-party developers, including companies like Squaresoft, who had provided the Final Fantasy series, which were some of the most popular games on the Super Nintendo, and some of the best games on the Super Nintendo, and they ended up bailing on Nintendo and decided to work with Sony, or in very rare cases Sega, as using cartridges wasn't just confusing because they seemed older by comparison. CDs offered massive advantages over cartridges, because the cartridges that were used on every system, maybe minus the Switch, I don't know. I'm guessing the Switches are still more expensive to make than a standard CD, but cartridges were more expensive to produce than CDs. And cartridges offered far less storage space than a CD. And also a cartridge can play back CD quality audio. The only benefit to going with a cartridge was a lack of load times, which, yes, is convenient to the consumer, and now we are trying to cut down load times as much as possible in this new generation. But at the time, that's not really something that the developer cares about because they've got big, ambitious projects that they can create fully on the PlayStation and in some cases the Saturn. But they can't make it on the N64 because they can't get that higher quality audio. They can't get those better graphics. They cannot get the higher storage space that's required to store those graphics, to store that audio, and to make the games bigger and more expansive and better. So having no load times wasn't worth it to any developer. So ultimately, the N64 started the whole trend of Nintendo basically going at it alone with their consoles, having little to no third-party support. And that cemented them where they are now. They had the same mistake with the GameCube with using the proprietary mini DVD format instead of going for full-size DVDs. So they ran into the exact same issues with the GameCube. And then they just gave up on the hardcore gaming market entirely with the Wii and tried to focus on the casuals, which worked temporarily, but like the N64, hurt them in the long run because when they went to the Wii U, the casuals had moved on to smartphones and they didn't know, and if they knew the Wii U existed, they thought it was a tablet add-on for the Wii. So nobody was buying that. And the hardcore market wasn't interested in what Nintendo was offering either because they basically spent all of the last generation being told that, yeah, we don't need you. We're Nintendo and we have the Wii and we're just doing casual stuff now. We don't need you proper gamers. Goodbye. So Nintendo wouldn't really recover until the Switch fully. I mean, financially they did fine, and financially now they're the most profitable company in Japan. So I'm not saying like financially Nintendo were bleeding dry or something. Like they weren't as dire as Sega in terms of financial success, but their image was hurt by the N64, which led into the GameCube, which led into the Wii and the Wii U. So, due to Nintendo and Sega making some incredibly questionable decisions, and Sony seemingly doing everything right, the PlayStation was a juggernaut success that could not be stopped. In the end, it ended up being the first console ever to sell over 100 million units, and it left Nintendo and Sega in the dust, with them only selling 33 million and 9 million units respectively. There was no competition this generation. The PlayStation came out of nowhere, basically, and just dominated these two. And it would continue to do so in coming generations. Like, obviously, Sega only had one more generation, but Sony would win in the second generation that they existed in the sixth generation with the PlayStation 2. They would lose to Nintendo with the PS3, but the PS3 still sold incredibly well. And they absolutely dominated Nintendo with the PS4 compared to the Wii U. The Switch is now selling incredibly well, but I'm not sure if it'll hit the PS4 levels of success. It might do. Who knows? But Sony clearly cemented themselves here as a titan in the video game industry. And there seems to be no stopping them. Like, barring some huge mistake that, damages Sony like they were before they went to the PS4, like with that original launch PS3, barring something stupid like that, I don't think they're going to be leaving the market anytime soon. Even if we go to like an all-digital future, they'll still be making a digital-only console, I believe. So now that we've discussed some of the history of the console and how the console did in the market, etc., let's dive into the physical appearance of the system. So, here I have both models of the PlayStation, as well as the PlayStation Classic over there. The original PlayStation design is classic. I think that it looks great. However, there were certain reliability issues, particularly with the laser on this guy. Nothing as widespread as the Red Ring of Death on the 360, but it was common enough for Sony to want to fix it with later models. What people would do to try and counteract this is they would take the system and they would stand it up like this. And this is why the PlayStation 2 actually was designed to stand vertically in some cases, because of this issue that was present in this original PlayStation 1. But for some extreme cases, people would actually just turn it upside down and leave it like that. Because believe it or not, that would actually get the games to read on the occasion. The problem happened because, essentially, on these original models, the power supply was placed too close to the laser. And over time, the laser would essentially be fried by the power supply. Sony over time would refine this original design, stripping out unnecessary parts to lower costs, like every console ever has done. Well, not every, but you know what I mean. And eventually, near the PlayStation 2's launch, they decided to stop producing this model over here, and they instead went to this, which is called the PS1. This is called the PlayStation, this is called the PS1. So, I mean, they're both the PlayStation 1, but technically this is the only system that is called PS1. So, this is obviously a far smaller version of the console, and it has an optional screen attachment that allowed you to play games semi-portably, as you still need an AC adapter to power the screen and the console, but it was still an incredibly cool concept. This console was far more reliable than the original version, and it was more compact. If you're looking for an original PlayStation today, then I'd recommend this model right here. Avoid this one if possible, because it does have reliability issues. Get this one if possible, because it works much better than this one does. But I'd recommend this one, but you can also play PlayStation 1 games on any model of the PlayStation 2 or any model of the PlayStation 3. So, I'll just move this to the side a sec here. Now, I have all 4 variations of the controllers here. So, we'll start off by just bringing them all in here a sec. If I can actually get them all in one shot, that'd be nice. Well, okay, I can get 3. The 4th one we can show in a minute. But basically, right? One of these controllers, this one on the right here, the DualShock, is straight up iconic. And all 3 of them are good in my opinion, but the DualShock, and particularly this one in the middle here, which we'll get back to, these are great controllers. At launch, we got these controllers, the digital controllers as they're called, because they don't have any analog inputs. This controller obviously lacks analog sticks, but it also lacks rumble, and these are incredibly light feeling. The DualShock didn't come out until after the N64 came out, and the DualShock was basically, it felt like a response to the N64, having an analog stick and a rumble pack. The DualShock obviously has rumble built in, has 2 far better analog sticks. Like, the N64 analog stick is bad, let's just be fair. So, these original controllers are good, but they are very basic when you get down to it. Like, this has basically 2 more buttons than a Super Nintendo controller. Like, you've got the D-pad over here, you've got the 4 face buttons, and you have 2 sets of triggers up top. The SNES only lacked these 2 buttons here, so this controller is very basic when you get down to it. But eventually, the DualShock controller, which is this one here, this is the one that most of you probably know, this is far better. Not just in terms of design, but also practicality and comfort. The DualShock is honestly a much better controller for games that were released this generation. A lot of games this generation wouldn't be as good without its controller. Like, it'd still be playable and everything, but the use of rumble and especially analog sticks for more precise controls really helped in platformers, racing games, and stuff like that. However, in between the DualShock and the original digital controllers, there was this controller, and this is called the Dual Analog Controller. This is a fairly rare controller. It wasn't around very long. It was quickly replaced by the DualShock, and it's basically the same as the DualShock, except the sticks are concave instead of convex, and they have a hard plastic exterior instead of a rubberized one that this one has. So the sticks aren't, like, they're nice feeling, and I really like them, but the lack of a soft plastic really is a bit unfortunate, if we're being honest. And this controller also doesn't have rumble, but it has the longer triggers of the DualShock, and has the analog sticks of the DualShock. And I'm pretty sure it has flight controls built in. But honestly, if I'm being perfectly honest, I prefer the design and the form factor of the dual analog controller to the DualShock. Yeah, I know. Like, this obscure controller that nobody's ever heard of is better than this controller everybody had. Why would I say such a thing? Basically, this controller feels a lot more like a PlayStation 4 controller than it does to a PlayStation 3 controller. Or a PlayStation 2 or 1 controller. The dual analog controller has longer grips on it, which I personally really like. The lack of rumble is annoying, but ultimately, I mean, I don't really need Rumble. Like, I would usually play the PlayStation 1 with this controller, or a DualShock 2 on the PS2. But if I'm playing on an original PlayStation 1, this is the controller I'll jump to most of the time. Because I just prefer the form factor. It's so much more comfortable to me. Like, these longer triggers and the concave thumbsticks are really nice feeling. If you can get your hands on this controller, I would recommend getting it, because it's a really nice, comfortable controller, especially if you find the DualShock too small, because more and more I hear people saying that they find this controller to be too small for them, but they find like the PlayStation 4 controller perfectly fine. If you're somebody who likes the PlayStation 4 controller but not the PlayStation 1, 2, or 3 controllers, I would recommend grabbing the dual analog controller, because it feels much closer to a PlayStation 4 controller than it does to a DualShock. So, let's just move these two out the way and move that to the side as well. And we'll bring in the fourth controller, which is basically just a controller that coincides with the PS1. It's a slightly updated DualShock 1 controller. It's almost the exact same, but if I can get the thing. The connector here is rounded instead of being square or rectangular like the DualShock for the original PlayStation was. It's also got a much lighter color to match the color of this PlayStation console design. So, not a huge change. It's basically, it's functionally the same thing. It's just slightly different, slightly tweaked to match more with the PS1 than the original PlayStation over there. So, the PlayStation used memory cards to store games, saves. As obviously, with a cartridge system, you could just save games directly to the cartridge, but obviously on a CD, you can't do that. So, you would buy a memory card, you plug that into the front of the system. Just take out the case and show you. Plug that into the front, just there, and that would save your games. These cards are very iconic. Like, everyone knows the jokes of having to leave your system on because you didn't own a memory card or, something like that. And these memory cards store about 15 blocks of storage, which I'm not sure how much that equates to in megabytes, but it's not a lot. You could store roughly 10 game saves per card on average. Sometimes you get more if your game requires only like 1 or 2 blocks, but some games required way more blocks, like Gran Turismo 2. So, these memory cards, you would often need multiple memory cards if you had a large game collection, or you'd have to make the unfortunate sacrifice of deleting certain saves. But now, speaking of games, let's get on to the games. Now, as I've said, there was a lot of games. Over 2,000 individual titles were released worldwide. So, I can't cover everything. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover some of the games that I really enjoyed, both when I was younger and now that I've gotten to experience them. So, some games that I really enjoy for the PlayStation are Gran Turismo 1, Crash Bandicoot 1, 2, 3, Crash Team Racing, Spyro 1, 2, and 3, Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, Klonoa, which is incredibly expensive and hard to find, but it's a great game, VIB Ribbon, Rayman 1 and 2, Mega Man X4 and X5, Mega Man 8, and this list could go on and on and on. Like, there's so many more good games. Like, Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2 are great, although I personally prefer to play them on the Dreamcast, but they're still great games as well. Gran Turismo 2 is enjoyable as well. I mean, I prefer Gran Turismo 1 for the nostalgia, but Gran Turismo 2 is also a great game, and arguably probably the better game of the two. But there were just so many brilliant games on the PlayStation. There was such a heavy amount of variety as well. Like, there was action, there was RPGs, there was racing, there was platformers. I believe there's something for everybody on the PlayStation 1. Because the variety here is just stellar. So, that is just a highlight reel of some of the games for the system. Like, they're some of my favorites personally. So, the PlayStation was an incredibly important console to me personally. As I've said already, it was the second console I ever played after the PlayStation 2. And I had a model like this one. This is a newer one I bought recently. But my original one broke a long time ago due to some unforeseen complications. Let's just say I beat a certain someone at Gran Turismo a few too many times. But I later got a new one, which is this PS1 right here, and this still works perfectly well to this day. It's fairly reliable, but this one, my original model of this was destroyed in action, shall we say. So, my first two games that I ever played, honestly, were Sonic Heroes on the PS2, that was first, and then Gran Turismo 1 on the PlayStation 1. Over the years, I've put so much time into these two games, and the original Gran Turismo is still probably my favorite racing game of all time. Its only competition to me is Gran Turismo 6 on PS3, and that probably, again, is the better game, but my nostalgia for Gran Turismo 1 is so high, like, it's that good to me that I would still consider it so great after all this time when far better racing games have come out, arguably. So, yeah, play Gran Turismo 1. Great game. But, so let's finish off here just by closing out with some final thoughts here. So, the PlayStation revolutionized the video game industry and proved itself as the definitive third main company in the console industry, beating out the other competitors that tried to compete in this market. And they have been the most successful hardware manufacturers in the industry ever since. At their worst, they came in second, selling 87 million units with the PlayStation 3. And when that is your worst home console performance, you're clearly doing something right. The PlayStation is a modern classic that some may argue the games haven't aged, that some of the games have aged poorly, and while, of course, they're not as visually impressive as titles nowadays, visuals and graphics aren't everything, and a lot of these games are incredibly fun to play, have phenomenal soundtracks, control well, and are just timeless classics that I feel like everyone can enjoy, as long as you're not, some like graphics whore or something. But I implore you to play the PlayStation and its phenomenal library of games. It is a brilliant console. Even if you can't get an original console, or if you don't want to, which is a bit strange because you can get them really cheap nowadays because there are so many of them. But if you can't get an original PlayStation for whatever reason, any model of the PS2 and the PS3 can play these games. So go on, grab some of these great iconic games, and you'll be thankful that you did because the PlayStation has some absolutely amazing games. It's a brilliant system, and it's hard to believe it's 25 years since it came out. Like, I mean, I know I wasn't alive for all of it, but 25 years is that's quite a long time, like. And honestly, the games still hold up after all this time. So, that's my take on the PlayStation 1 on its 25th anniversary. I'm planning on doing like update anniversary videos every year not every year, every 5 years for these systems. Like every time like it reaches a multiple of 5, I'm gonna create an updated version of this. So in 2025, 30th anniversary of the PlayStation, I'll be back talking about it, saying largely the same thing, but hopefully the production values will have increased somewhat. So, I'd like to thank everyone for watching. I hope you really enjoyed this. Sorry that it's, long, but I mean, if you're watching one of my videos, you probably expect to be sitting down for a while. So, thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this, and I shall see you next time when I upload something else. I'm not sure what yet, but I'll figure that out. Bye for now, everyone. Thank you again.